Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming along, and I would like to welcome everyone who's came to our 5th webinar. We're back sort of by popular demand. We only originally were going to do 4, but we request you come back to continue discussion about the environment and sustainability. So with that, we have with us today Dr. Ariel Edisis, who's a research assistant of Low Cali and Clean Growth UK at LGMU. Dr. John Marchant, the Chief Support Astronomer at Liverpool Telescope from LGMU. Mark Drinkwater, Head of Earth and Mission Science Division from the European Space Agency. Owen Thompson, Member of Parliament for Midlothian, who sits in the House of Commons. And we are hopefully going to be joined by Sarah Krudas, who unfortunately at the moment has not made it along, but we're still hoping for her to join later on. So just before we start with that, the normal rules do apply in regards to this. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which will be monitored by our team to ask questions when we get some time. And if you'd like to place in your details into the webinar chat for your LinkedIn profiles, if you're looking to sort of network with people, please feel free to do so. Okay, so just before we kick off then, again, a big thank you very much to everyone that's came along to join us, and we'll get on with this sort of webinar with that. So the first part we would like to speak about in regards to this is we want to go on and talk about emissions. So in our regards, harmful emissions. So one of the main concerns raised by environmentalists when talking about rockets is in regards to the harmful emissions that accompany each launch, such as carbon dioxide, alumina, nitrogen oxides, chlorides, sulfur compounds and such. Some can increase the warming to our planets and other can work towards ozone depletion. How seriously should we be taking these emissions? John, would you like to start?
Well, it's just my own personal opinion, but yes, in terms of like if you're standing downwind of a rocket launch, that's not a good place to be. I mean, these are actually, you know, quite nasty chemicals to breathe in. But on a global scale, if like there was a launch in New Zealand and you were in England, then it wouldn't really affect you. And I think currently at the moment, given the amount of rocket launches we get at the moment, it's quite small compared to, you know, what you get from cars and aeroplanes and shipping as well. Actually, believe it or not, those massive container ships, they pump out just as much carbon and nasty stuff as the entire air industry, perhaps even more. I don't really have the figures in front of me at the moment, but I've heard that was quite big. So yeah, rocket launch is bad if you're next door, but you know, spread out over the globe, it's small at the moment anyway, in my opinion.
Excellent. Mark, would you like to chip in?
Obviously, ESA is a public funded space organization. We are held accountable for our environmental impact. So it's been something that's been scrutinized for quite a number of years now. And it's led to a number of actions from ESA regarding clean space and green space. And we'll get to talk about that, I'm sure. Obviously, rocket launches produce a plume of exhaust. This can be vapor trail, or it can be carbon dioxide emissions, or it could be other forms of particulates, alumina or black carbon. Obviously, these can have direct or indirect effects radiatively in the atmosphere in terms of either suppressing incoming radiation or trapping outgoing radiation, and that can have an environmental consequence as well as contributing, I guess, to the greenhouse effect. We are concerned about, therefore, about the use of different types of rocket fuels, and that's led to some of the initiatives inside EASE for green propellants and so on and so forth. I guess the longer term concern environmentally is the buildup of long-lived particulates that might have an impact in the stratosphere, and that's something that we do have to take account of. As we've heard, the carbon dioxide emission issue might be extremely negligible by comparison to other industrial contributors, and so I don't attribute much significance to that, but these radiative impacts and the impact on the stratosphere are probably the things that we need to learn about a little bit more. So we should be held accountable. We have to understand the impacts and the effects of these things, and that's something that we're looking into through activities inside ESA at the moment. Yeah.
Excellent. Ariel, would you like to join in anything?
Yeah, I guess so. If I can just maybe come from a slightly different angle, because I think that what you've kind of both John and Mark have highlighted is the emissions themselves from the rocket are not necessarily the area that we need to be worried about. Like, I think if you look at, it's an interesting time to look at, say, how transport emissions have been affected by the current crisis that we're in. Because they've gone down a lot, but they've not gone down to the level that we need to go down. So I just feel like it's such a tiny, narrow part of it, which is a problem. And like, again, this isn't necessarily my background. So in terms of the actual fuel, I mean, I'm understanding a little bit about that, but you can't paper over where everything is coming from. How is it getting there? How is it manufactured? I just wonder, I think that's where I mean, when I think about the emissions, I'm thinking about it far beyond the fuel, because, you know, as far as I'm understanding, as far as you've said, it isn't necessarily the worst part. And my background is actually more towards shipping. It's in offshore wind energy, which is really bad. And I think it's interesting to think in the same idea, the emissions are really bad. So you've got to think about that, but you've also got to think about, you know, if I think about in shipping, how do you just reduce the number of ships that are going? How do you change the material? How do you change how it gets there? So I guess for me, it's hard to just focus on that aspect of it. It just feels too narrow.
Okay, thank you for that. I know, and obviously from yourself, for a government point of view, in working down in Westminster, what are the sort of views that have you seen down there?
Well, I think, to my mind, when I think of the space industry in its entirety, it's an industry based around innovation. So if there's an industry anywhere that can come up with new ways of working, new ways of developing technologies, new ways of designing fuels, designing how and what materials are used to design and build any part of the process, the space industry surely have got to be at the forefront of that, because by nature, ingenuity is a part of the sort of fundamentals of the industry and what drives the sort of that desire to sort of do something new and to create something new and to do it in a different way that actually could then ultimately benefit countless other industries. Because if you guys are finding different ways to produce the rocket fuel, or to find different ways to project the rockets into orbit, that will ultimately work its way through to other industries who can then say, we could actually take the workings here, we could incorporate that into what we do. And just the design and the processes, I mean, I know from my own visits to Derek at Skyrora, sort of, and just seeing the way they work, if that ingenuity is replicated across the industry, you know, it's such a strong position to be in, such a strong position for other industries to learn from. So as much as yet, I think there is a real opportunity for space to be at the forefront of driving change, and how we look to what industry can do to help to tackle some of the issues around climate change. And well, emissions are an important factor, and obviously community, because as an elected member, community is always going to be central to the thinking I have. So dealing with some of the concerns that a community might have about, oh, what's this going to mean if there's a launch near us or in the sort of 2 villages over, that sort of thing. Tackling these things head on with the ability to say, well, yes, this is happening here, but here's why this is a positive, and actually being in the front foot about these things. Because I think in the past, too often things have happened where communities are almost the afterthought, whereas actually if we incorporate that at the front of any process, that will help to make a better decision-making process all in all. And it means that the position for the companies trying to do new things is supported. It makes an elected member's job a dream if a community's been involved from the start, because yes, there might be concerns, but you know what they are, and then you can work together to try and move it forward. So I see real opportunities to help drive forward change.
Thank you for that one. Well, my next question, I'm going to slightly change over because when we're speaking with Johnny, he did highlight how much basically rocket launches are compared to the other industries in the world for giving out some of these emissions. I know from the figures I've got sitting in front of me, rocket launches from 2018 count as 0.00001% of the global CO2 emissions. So that, I think Ariel has been right in that regards, that emissions are only part and parcel of the picture.
Yeah, I think that was, I mean, as I was kind of doing a bit of my own research for this, I think that in general, there's just I mean, I think not to be pushing back on everything, but I think there's always a point to proceed with the whole picture in mind. And I quite like what Owen just said about starting with the community first. And I think there is a point about bringing them along and not focusing on such a tiny part of the emissions, because the picture is so much broader than that.
Okay, well, if we were to open that up a little bit bigger, given the increased focus on sustainability and environmental concerns at the moment, who do you believe should be taking charge of the responsibilities and regulating this? If we're not just launching in the UK, but the sector as a whole, should it be the companies that are doing launches? Should it be spaceports, or should it be the government, or should it be someone completely different? Owen, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, to my mind, it should probably be a combination of all of the above. Exactly who should be the absolute leader in that, I'm probably open to conversion in that, because I think too often legislation's made and it's not fit for purpose, and then you spend years trying to unpick it, amend it, and try to fix problems that could actually have been resolved before it even started if it had been done in a different way. And I suppose I would probably come to this from the way I would address many community issues, in that if you can actively involve the industry at the start to find out what's needed, then you can actually incorporate that and develop better legislation. Now, industry and government might not always be aligned, but actually having that discussion before it's simply a case of, here is the legislation that you now need to adhere to. If there's a conversation in advance of that that then says, this is the industry's wants, this is where we want to get to, this is how we can get there, and actually in us doing that, this is what we can do to help and support the aims of our government. Legislation could then be developed that's built on the expertise of the industry and not on legislation drafters. And I'm not in any sense doing down anyone who drafts legislation, because that in itself is an art form. But you need to be making sure that you can bring the industry with you, otherwise you end up with legislation that's simply not workable.
Ariel, would you like to pick up?
I think it's interesting because you started. So I think I would say government, but government that's informed by the people. And I think, so what I think as well, I think this is in terms of anything science-based. And I think where we sort of struggle with this idea about policy is, like, people see a policy, and if it goes into action and it doesn't really work, they see it as wrong. Whereas what we should see it as like a stepping stone. Okay, we can change it. So, I mean, my view feels like government should be the leaders, but it needs to be informed. Like, I think when I learned a bit more about who is actually drafting the policy and who's providing input into the policy and who is it they're asking the opinion of, that seems to be where it's a bit skewed in a way that's not suiting the people. So it feels like, I mean, I think there's a few things. I feel like government-led, but massively important is it needs to be dynamic. And I think we need to build into any new policy the fact it might be wrong. It might not be the right way forward, and there might be unintended consequences which we couldn't foresee at the start, which doesn't make it inherently bad, but it just means that we need to maybe start from a point of, we're figuring this out together. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. John, would you like to put anything into this?
I think they've basically said what I was thinking of, really. I don't think it should be left up to any one particular organization. Certainly, I don't think it should be left up to just the space companies themselves, because you always then run the risk of them trying to be self-serving and cutting corners as far as the environment's concerned. So yeah, I think there should be some serious government involvement, and there should be a lot of input from third-party independent experts in academia, everybody. As to the actual breakdown, the actual share of this part of thing, like Ariel was saying, it should be dynamic. There should be regular reviews so you can see, is this working or not? Are things stagnating? So yes, there should be a mix, but the actual division I'm not sure on, but yeah, mix.
Excellent, thanks for that. And Mark, I'll come to you, because in this one, you're already, with being part of ESA, obviously this is things that have already been established within ESA. So what is the framework like with yourselves?
Well, doing nothing's not an option. Space industry has to comply with regulations. These will be of an environmental nature, and we'll always have to deal with policy as well that can be used both as a guideline and to prevent nuisance activities. Clean space allows us to do things like lifecycle assessment and eco-design. Lifecycle assessment helps to clarify the materials use, the energy use, and emissions throughout the whole production chain for all the activities that both go into developing satellites and launching them and operating them, of course. We also have to look into deorbiting solutions and debris removal, because that's an environmental issue which is becoming a lot more of priority to avoid too much space debris polluting the key orbits. And of course, we're obliged to deorbit satellites today ourselves, the public funded satellites. We're obliged to deorbit them within a fixed number of years in a controlled, safe fashion. And I think commercial space and new space should be obliged to follow the same kinds of rules as we're obliged to follow. Now, green technologies that are being introduced also now enable us to do things in a cleaner way, and it allows us to reduce energy consumption during the development and the life cycle of the development of a space mission. We can use the resource in a more sustainable fashion. It helps us to limit the number of harmful substances and whatnot that go into the production. This will have a more limited impact on both on human health, obviously, as well as biodiversity. And so we really have to adopt a more proactive approach to addressing and tackling how we go about doing our business in respect to environmental legislation. And so, as I said, doing nothing is not an option. This will take a hold on what we all do, be it space or new space. And by taking early action and trying to implement processes that are greener and more environmentally friendly, I think industry in Europe will have an advantage to move forwards in the future.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Mark. Just a reminder to those attendees, I'm seeing some come into the chat. If you want to ask a question, please direct it to the Q&A so we can try and cover them all later. That way we don't miss anything. But going on to our next part here. So today we have a large number of satellites in orbit that are doing things from tracking glaciers melting to monitoring carbon dioxide levels, among many other useful applications. How do you believe that this sort of technology is contributing to fighting the existing environmental crises? And Mark, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, I just have had a long dialogue, and so I'm sorry to come back again. Yeah, we've contributed in this arena quite significantly over the last 2 decades, learning from the experience of our ENVISAT satellite. We've been supporting the European Union in developing the whole Copernicus system, and that's in conjunction with the European Union. That's allowed us to launch a suite of Sentinel satellites, which together with our research-based Earth explorers entitle us to information about the environment, the global environment, in a way which we could never have foreseen in the past. Copernicus is opening a whole new window to the world with measurements from a variety of different techniques, all-weather radar, optical imaging systems, more metrological measuring systems like lasers or radar altimeters. And the combination of all this information gives us really unprecedented access to information about all aspects of the environment. And so we're in a privileged position today with all of this free and open data, which is being produced for the benefit of you all. And we want you to use it, and we want to profit from this knowledge from the standpoint of managing the environment. So as regards sustainable development, these data are there, and we want them to be used on a day-to-day basis, 24/7, for managing the environment. And that's really our goal.
Thank you for that. Ariel, what about yourself?
Well, in terms of the act, like I have some ideas of sort of the environmental tracking in terms of, you know, tracking glaciers melting, tracking deforestation, etc. I think the thing that I think could be the most valuable, and by I mean is most valuable, is to increase communication and increase connectivity. Because if you think, I mean, one thing I'm quite interested in is looking beyond technology for ways to reduce emissions. And I always have this book just sitting right behind me called Drawdown. And I think it's quite a good example, because if you think a bit broader around where space tech can contribute to maybe increasing education in places that don't have access to a good Wi-Fi connection, I see that as maybe some of the most valuable ways of doing it. The book behind me lists educating girls as the #5 most effective way to reduce global warming. So if you're going to really think broadly, I think there's this opportunity to, like, yes, there's a really important aspect around actually monitoring the earth and actually looking at the environment, but we can go so much broader than that. Because, I mean, I've been thinking as well, because, and this is just in thinking about, you know, preparing for this, you know, if you've got a satellite and it's over a certain area, presumably there should also be working with that area. You know, there's this incentive to, like, invest there as well. And I think especially those of us in wealthier countries where our emissions are the ones that are, you know, we're the problem. We have this opportunity to kind of, you know, not only track like deforestation or deserts or glaciers, etc., but to actually go down. And I think back again to what Owen was saying about starting with the community level. And I think, I mean, that's where I see some of the most, maybe not, I won't say most interesting, but maybe areas that I just don't see highlighted enough. And it's just this opportunity. Like, I think we forget how important behavioral change and the way people live their lives and all these things are to emissions. We cannot go down in emissions on technology alone. So I just think there is a really interesting opportunity, but we could miss it.
Excellent, thank you for that. John, would you like to take up next?
Yeah, there's a couple of points which, I mean, I agree with everything. I mean, Mark and Ariel know more about me on a large aspect of this question, but which occurred to me was, I mean, with the effects of research. I mean, on the actual space probes that have gone to other planets and studied the atmospheres of other planets have told us a hell of a lot about our own planet. So, I mean, it's not just, in my opinion anyway, it's not just remote sensing Earth satellites. It's basically the same kind of thing around other planets. That's actually contributed a lot to our own studies of our own environment. But also what Ariel was saying about, like, basically changing people's attitudes as well. It isn't happening yet, but it's on the doorstep, is space tourism, I think. You know, I mean, they say a lot of people, if they've been in Earth orbit for a while, they come down and it's like changed their viewpoint completely. I mean, it's well documented, the Apollo astronauts and that feeling, and a lot of Earth orbiting, you know, ISS astronauts do that. I mean, technically, if you've got, you know, I mean, you don't have to go into space to get that realization, but it helps, you know. And if space tourism gets a lot cheaper, like you can, for the price of like an airplane ticket to New Zealand or something, you can go into orbit for a couple of days, you know, and then they will go back and tell their friends and stuff. And it might, especially like influential people who are generally rich, politicians, people like that, they could go up and come down, and, you know, it could change a lot of things.
That's an interesting idea.
Owen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, this again, probably to me, this comes back to the ingenuity and opportunities that are currently there. I mean, there's so much new information being gathered. Again, I know from my chats with Derek and the team, as they sort of work with the authorities to sort of work towards launch and further launches and developing the sort of regulations around that, the information that's being gathered, there's new information being discovered all the time, and that is able to be used to get a far better understanding of what's happening just around the globe in environmental terms. It creates a level of expertise throughout the industry that could then benefit other areas to again better understand where we could perhaps do things differently in tackling climate change. And whenever any of this information has been gathered, it comes back to, I think, the points that Mark was making. It's so important that there's transparency around that, and this information is available for access, so that we can get that wider understanding, because it's only when you can kind of get everyone on board and get that level of understanding, you sort of have that step change moment, and it happens at various points as we go along. I mean, it wasn't really that many years ago when sort of there were many people wouldn't think twice about jumping in the car, having had a drink, jump in the car, having not bothered to put on their seatbelts, whereas now we've had an absolute societal change that's been a step change. We're now, I think, not far away from the point where that's going to happen towards how we look after the planet. There's a number of elements towards that, and I just think the space industry could play such a significant role in that, because a lot of the information that can be gathered that isn't available anywhere else, and it's the opportunities that presents as well. So I think this is why it's so important, and for my mind, it's why partly why I've been so keen to sort of get involved and be very supportive, is to see the opportunities that are there to drive forward that wider change and support that wider change, but backed up by information that's independent. It's not the government are telling us to do this, which is at times causes an automatic knee-jerk reaction from some people to go, well, I'm not doing it then. Whereas actually, David Attenborough has probably had a greater impact on people's attitudes towards climate change than any government policy has had in I don't know how many years. So it's finding the ways to do that in a way that's actually accessible to the public, and then we can make the changes that we need to do.
Excellent.
Can I just step in for a second? Because I think we are in this really, really interesting time about how quickly our behavior can change. And if we think about climate change as a genuine emergency, we are living in a genuine emergency. And I think, I just think it's such an interesting time to be having this conversation, because we've seen how quickly we can change our behavior. Yeah. And we have seen how quickly emissions could drop. I think one thing that we need to realize is they might drop by 7% this year if we continue with where we're at, as in staying locked down for the whole year. They need to drop by like 7 or 8% every year this decade to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. I think it's just, I think it's just, sorry for stepping in, but one thing I got a bit kind of interested in was the launch of Sputnik, and how drastically and quickly that launched a space industry. It didn't exist before. There was no acceptance of this amount of government spending on space until one launch, really. And I think there's this opportunity right now to do that again. We've done it before. Yeah. Sorry.
No, thank you for that. I'm actually going to tweak the next question slightly, given some of the answers there. So what I was going to ask are, what are some of the most innovative ways which space technology has helped work towards global sustainability goals? But given what you were saying as well, Ariel, in regards to helping educate sort of females in poorer areas, what ways could you see the space industry helping to, which will help develop this cultural change and social change? Would you like to start that, Ariel?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one thing I've been interested in, just in my own work now, is like everything is so connected, you really can't separate things. So, I mean, in terms of access to communication, access to, I mean, you know, I think like Wi-Fi shouldn't be something that we need to pay for. It should be something that we all have access to. And I think it's it could be one of the most effective way to actually making sure, like, we can actually work together much more clearly across the globe to make sure that we can help in education, or make sure some people have access to material and actually can step outside their own environment. And we can, I feel like that's probably, to me, one of the clearest ways. I mean, we could give connectivity, communication, assist with, I mean, as far as I understand, and that's not just in developing countries. I mean, there's a lot of areas that don't have access to the internet here in the UK as well. So, I mean, I guess that's one of the things. It's one of the, I mean, I don't know enough, again, about this industry to know that, but I think in terms of communication and I mean, there's also, like, I mean, one thing I've been thinking is, if you're going to put something up there, I think, Owen, you might have said something about this as well, but if you're also, in addition to that, you are informing people about, why are we doing this? Why is it going up there? There's you know, maybe we don't have to launch people into space to make them feel more connected to what's going on. Yeah.
Thanks for that. John, would you like to start up?
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's, you know, I don't think, unfortunately, a large part of the human race are going to clean up their act out of the goodness of their hearts. It's got to be done by just advances in technology. So, you know, the sooner we completely stop being dependent on fossil fuels, for example, you know, I mean, it's happening already with electric cars, so long as the carbon footprint of making the electric cars and generating the electricity to charge them up is better than what we have now in terms of burning all the fossil fuels, then that's going to be a way to do it. And like Ariel was saying, educate people, advances in connectivity with remote areas, like all who are slashing and burning the Brazilian rainforest and stuff like that. If they've got fantastic TV and they can watch David Attenborough shows all the time, you know, that might have a big effect. And again, I've said it before, but I mean, space tourism again as well. I mean, we've got a little bit of that already. I mean, it's offline at the moment, but on the International Space Station, up until recently, there was a high definition, off-the-shelf high definition camera just pointing down at the ground all the time, 24/7, and you could just go to it on your web browser, and there you are. And if you looked at the map and see where the ISS is going, you can see, oh, it's going to go over the UK in 10 minutes. It's not, you know, if it's during the daytime, so you can't go out and watch it go over, but you can be on the space station looking down, and you can, oh, there's my house, that kind of thing. And it's, I mean, you know, that kind of thing would be absolutely fascinating if it was more well known. But also if you actually had, I don't know, a very lucky TV presenter on the ISS just saying, you know, and today we're looking at this country as we go over. Just something just to really get the public involved in, just realizing that we're actually just all sitting around on an 8,000 mile wide ball of rock that's flying through space. We are already actually in space. And at the moment, this is all we've got. Something to give people that kind of slight sense of vertigo. It's like, whoa, there's nothing underneath this kind of thing, you know. You're sitting down, there's 8,000 miles of rock underneath your feet, and then nothing for infinity, forever. It's that kind of realization that I think a lot of people, maybe in the back of the mind, they realize it, but something to really bring it home all the time is, so when they look at the sky, they see it in 3D, and it's not just what appears to be a painting to them or something, you know. Just something to really just make people realize where they are, and at the moment, this is the only foothold we've got to live on, you know. So, like I say, the David Attenborough effect, that kind of thing, but on a, you know, in terms of space, kind of thing. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Owen, would you like to?
I mean, education is kind of fundamental to driving any change, and particularly to move anyone out of poverty. I mean, the current pandemic, you just need to look at the impacts that poverty has on the infection rates and survival rates on any country where the virus is hit. And I mean, it's tragic that, and it's unfortunately the case that those who are wealthy and have money are in a far better position to be able to not only avoid having to go to the places where they might be more likely to become affected, but they're able to pay for tutors for the kids so that they can still learn while the schools are closed and all this sort of stuff. So, I mean, I think to take Gary's point, I think some form of way to sort of enhance access to information, be that just the information and individuals can learn for themselves, or be it a formalised education system, having access there in the first place removes one of the fundamental barriers that so many around the globe have. And space kind of, to me anyway, and I'm maybe biased in this because of my own views, but space kind of brings with it a sort of a real sort of stimulation for the imagination. And there's just, because it's so unknown, and because it's not even in the sea, you can see the sea, it's there, and probably if you've maybe even only put your toe in the water, you've touched it. Space is this huge thing that's up there and out there that you don't, other than seeing it in pictures or on a screen, that's the only time you see it, and it really does capture imagination. So there's a real hook there that could perhaps pull in people who might be more resistant to learning in other ways to sort of not even recognise that they're learning it, in fact, in some ways. So yeah, you can actually have that effect in situations where, I mean, I'm thinking perhaps in school environments, maybe some more challenging behaviours, and actually just that ability to stimulate imagination and looking at things in a different way, it can help to tackle so many different issues that could actually help support pretty major societal change. And beyond that, international development goals. I mean, again, Errol mentioned the education impact for girls around the globe. I mean, that's constantly an issue that's raised in Parliament, and it doesn't actually seem to get any better every time it's raised. It's still an issue. So if we can look to different ways and more imaginative ways to do things, but access to information, and if there's any way we can just everyone pulling together to do that, if that was an outcome from this that we were able to achieve, then the difference that could make to the planet would be fundamental.
Yeah, just to echo on that is working in astronomy. We've often said that because we have a section which actually goes into schools and introduces them to astronomy and everything, and it's been said that like astronomy is like one of the gateway drugs to learning about science, because it's full of pretty pictures and gosh wow stuff and everything. And like Owen was saying, it's the same about the space industry. That's rockets and astronauts and stuff. It's you know, it's a great way to get interested in the field, and as you learn, you pick up all sorts of things of how to think in a scientific way, and yeah, it's really good.
Can I just echo as well? Sorry, and then you can skip me and move on. I really like what Owen just said there about the it's very like space is like big, open, and scary and uncertain, and I do think that's really interesting. I think that's such a good point. I mean, it's such a good. I mean, it should be such a like exciting, bright, colorful, pretty way of getting really comfortable with like we have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
I like that. Thanks. Mark?
Yeah, I touched on a couple of things that John, Ariel, and Owen have all picked up on. To come back to the impact of what we can do with Earth observation, you know, I've had the privilege of working for NASA for 15 years before I came to ESA, and it's clear that the first images of Earth and this iconic image of the blue marble and the view from the moon back to Earth help to underscore, you know, the fragility of our environment. And it's that kind of thing which evokes a feeling and triggers this understanding that we have to do something about managing the environment, you know, for the benefit of humanity. So what does space do? It gives us this bigger picture. It gives us everything from the global scale to the country scale to the local scale. It allows us to access information about our local environment and to place that in a broader context, and to understand whether what we see in our local environment is typical, or whether it's typical or atypical of what's going around on the rest of the world. And so this unique vantage point, I think we have to take advantage of, because the images that we can transport to people today are part and parcel of the type of movement you were talking about, Ariel. This realization, this global realization that we all have a role to play in managing the environment. And so, yes, it comes down to educating people and transporting the information into a form that's consumable by everybody. Yeah, and so the trick is partly bound up in education, as you said, Owen and Ariel, and it's also about the communicating tools that allow you to access this source of information. We have to develop both of those things. Obviously, we're involved in engagement and training programs, and we try to do it at whatever level we can. But of course, you know, we're under the mandate of our space agencies, and for the most part, the resources that are invested in that kind of training are devoted largely to the member states themselves, and not around the world in places where we recognize that we have to give development assistance. So what are we trying to do to change that? Well, we've started a program, Earth Observation for Sustainable Development. We're trying to contribute to efforts in agriculture and rural development, in urban development around the world, water resources management, helping people develop climate resilience, resilience to disasters and risk, extreme weather, and to working with people in the marine resources sector. But obviously the people who are living around the world who are less privileged than we are the ones who are most at risk from the consequences of change in the environment, and certainly extreme weather and extremes. And so we've started a new program now called Global Development Assistance, and we're trying to work and have been working with the World Bank for a number of years to provide development aid assistance around the world. And our new program is to work with international financial institutions that allow us to harness, you know, offshore development aid in order to benefit regions around the world, and not only in our own member states, which is the original mandate of an intergovernmental agency like ESA. So it comes down to how do you leverage funds that can help you to develop these kind of efforts, particularly in the education arena and the training arena, and then we can transport the benefits of these data to the broader population around the world. And I think these are dimensions that we have to continue to work on to help address the UN, Sustainable Development Goals, or whatever the end objective should be of our programs. So we're trying to act responsibly within the perimeter of our programs, and we're trying to help initiate these kind of things that you're talking about, Ariel.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So I want you now, when you answer, to answer from your own backgrounds and such in this regard. So how do you reckon the big changes will happen over the next 10 years in regards to the environment, climate, sustainability, in regards to space technology or the new technologies coming along? Because I know Green Growth UK and such are looking at ways to make things better. But what are you seeing directly in your own areas of expertise? John, would you like to start off?
Well, unfortunately, a negative impact in that with the all of the new constellations which are going up, that's going to interfere with astronomical observations. By how much, I don't know. I'm actually starting to look into that myself, as well as a lot of other astronomers, actually. But yeah, at the moment, well, for example, like working on the Liverpool telescope, one of the things I used to do, it's all automated now, but it used to be a manual thing, which I did. I would actually look at all of the night's observations very quickly, just scan through them just to make sure there was nothing technically wrong with them or anything. And I would be seeing about half a dozen to maybe 9 or 10 streaks of satellites shooting through the field of view. Now, most of the time, those streaks would miss the actual target, which is usually a small object in the center of the frame, but sometimes it went through. But basically, I'm expecting that fraction to go up.
Yeah.
At the moment, I mean, I understand SpaceX are, you know, they're the main people who are putting up like 12,000 satellites. Okay, there are different shells, different orbit heights, different inclinations, but you usually find that most astronomical facilities are within about 30 or 40 degrees of the equator, so they will always be affected, no matter what the inclination of the orbit. Well, they're usually above 40 odd degrees. But yeah, I'm expecting that to go up, and they are working currently on making the satellites literally darker, either by literally like painting them a different color, coating them with something different, or putting on a sunshade, which I need to read more on. I don't really understand where that shade actually going. But the trouble is like astronomical observations rely on extremely faint objects. We look at very, very faint objects. So I don't think, offhand, I don't think they're going to be able to do something to those satellites to make them that faint so they don't interfere with things. Because some observations, you're actually literally counting photons coming from these faint objects. So if you have an object which looks faint to the naked eye, but through a large telescope with, say, a 2-meter diameter mirror or more, it would be dazzling. And it might not damage the equipment, but it would certainly damage the quality of the data. So if they can't make those objects extremely dark, I don't know how there can be like a compromise between the astronomical community and not just SpaceX but other companies as well. The only thing I can possibly think of is if those companies gave very, very up-to-date ephemerides of these satellites, so which are very dynamically updated, so the astronomers could basically avoid or shut down the exposure, let the satellite go through, and then reopen and carry on. It's an extra added layer of hassle which the astronomers are not happy about, but at the moment that's the only thing I can think of, which isn't a solution. If anybody here has got a better idea, I'm all ears. But yeah, that's the only thing I could. That's the main thing that's on my mind at the moment.
Thank you for that. Owen, would you like to go next?
I think we're going to see a lot more people power. I think people have found a voice, and we're going to see much more loud voices coming forward and making demands of the governments that represent them, because I think there has been an awakening that it's not just decision makers making decisions to suit themselves. It's the fact that elected members in whatever level of government are there to represent the communities that have put them there. And that, I think that is going to be becoming much more to the fore in the coming years. It's certainly over the last few years become much more noticeable, which I think is a great thing. Just to be clear, I think it's it's brilliant if you know that you're being representing a community who are more than happy to tell you what they think. Then it makes the job of an elected member so much more straightforward, because you can genuinely reflect the view of your community. So I certainly hope that that's what we see coming through much more to help to direct and to channel attention into making positive change, and whether that's something that's quick, whether that's something that will happen maybe a bit more gradually, or whether it is something that just suddenly off the back of things changing, people go, right, I want to have more of a say. It can only be a good thing.
Thanks for that one. Mark?
Yes, to follow on what Owen's saying, we're a public space agency funded by taxpayers' money. So we're obliged to respond to what the user and the taxpayer needs and wants. And in that respect, we should be responding to government requests that are somehow aligned with the taxpayers' needs. So yes, we'll continue to develop capabilities that respond to the needs and to deliver socio-economic benefits from use of the data that address those issues. Whether it be water pollution, whether it be atmospheric pollution, whether it be data for that's beneficial in a regulatory framework or whatever. Now, the biggest thing that I can say that we're involved in this type of response over the next several years and for the foreseeable future is the development of a carbon dioxide emissions monitoring system. This morning, we've had a meeting with the European Union. We had an online workshop all day this morning and yesterday to scope out a comprehensive emissions monitoring system that comprises space-based assets with measurements on the ground and modeling and forecasting elements provided by the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, for instance. And together with the satellite data, we'll be able to project how CO2 anthropogenic emissions are evolving over the course of the next decades. And this can be used as a tool to support both the monitoring and reporting and verification, which is required against, say, the Paris Agreement. But it also helps to understand whether government policy is effective and to what extent it's helping them to reduce their emissions so that their disclosed emissions reductions can start to become compliant in the future. Now, it's also a tool for revealing what's actually going on at the same time. And as we've seen from recent Sentinel-5 precursor data, we can see around the world where we have huge emissions of methane, for instance, and we can start to understand the impact of nitrogen dioxide and many other trace gases that are byproducts of combustion and industrial activity around the world. So this capability that we've been developing will find its way, I hope, into your hands. And to everybody who's listening and watching, we want you to make the best use out of it. And I foresee a future where space-based data is in everyday use in everybody's hands, on their telephone, in their mobile phone. Together with Galileo, you'll have a position, you'll know where you are, and you'll be able to receive a forecast of air pollutants or whatever it is. You'll be able to walk your child to school along the least polluted route, and you'll be able to find where you can go and bathe in clean water. You know, these are things that the public are demanding, and that's the type of benefit we should be delivering from our systems.
Excellent, thank you for that, Mark. And Ariel?
I think that, so this is not too dissimilar from what everyone else has been saying, but I think that the other point, especially from the job I'm doing now, where I'm working with businesses, there is a very clear corporate responsibility here, which has changed. And I think this year especially, I've come across so many examples of pushing for the need to put profit, not necessarily, well, yeah, I'm going to say second. I mean, there is this, I guess it's a fundamental change in how we view economics, really. Which, I think it's an interesting, I definitely think it needs to be people driven, but I think which I guess this is related. I mean, the people are hopefully setting expectations of how we need to be doing things. I think, like, this idea that there was a letter that went out in, I think, January this year by, I think it's Larry Fink. He's one of the biggest investors, and it was basically saying we cannot keep going down this route of just profit for stakeholders. So I think it's really, there can be this fundamental shift. I think whether we do it or not is going to be dependent on maybe more what other people are saying, how loud the people are. I mean, we just need to set expectations for what life should look like. And again, I do think we need to be realistic about what it's going to involve, because and it can't be technology alone. I mean, again, relating to where we are at right now, you know, if you think about the fact that what the type of life everybody is living right now, and the fact that if we continue to live this type of life, that still isn't enough to reduce our emissions to the Paris Agreement level. That just isn't enough every year until then. So I think there is this, I think we just don't have a choice. And I hope that the voices of people just get louder and louder and louder. We just expect things. If you're a business, your business has to make sure that, as I think, Mark, you're saying a few times, as ESA has to do, you have to make sure that your corporate responsibility is there, but not in a, not from ESA way, but I think not in a greenwashing way. I mean, this isn't going to be acceptable anymore. We can't tick boxes anymore. It needs to be real. So I guess I'm interested in what I'm reading about. I mean, lots of economists, lots of corporations, and I'm wondering, is there going to be enough pressure that the leaders in this are going to shift to those people who are actually making real differences? And the other thing, I guess, the thing I think I'm also interested in is the way we do messaging, which is something I guess we've mentioned a few times, but stepping away from this, like, look how great we are, and fully into the actually we're not so good and here's what we're doing about it. I mean, I think that's one of the something which, I mean, businesses that are doing a good job on this, like I do think there's quite a few, are starting from the point of we are not doing well. And I do think that's really important to do. We've got to stop pretending like we're doing better than we are.
Thank you very much for that. What I want to do is try and cover a couple of the questions that have came in at the moment with this. It's the first one that came in that I would picked up to answer was from Alexander. And he was asking, do you think the scale of space is too big for just individual governments, and should it be, the policy be discussed at a sort of ESA, NATO level, or even a new organization organized? What would your thoughts on that be? And I'll open this up to whoever would like to take it.
Yeah, I think it should be an international thing, really, because you can't just say, you can't just like cordon off part of space above your country or anything like that. That's silly. So it has to be something on, you know, organised by the UN or something like that. You know, I mean, there is an actual field called space law, you know, so it could be an offshoot of that. Or, you know.
Yeah, it's certainly too big for any one government of any shape or size to try to lay claim to. And I think if there's not a concerted effort to make it an element of cooperation across all governments at whatever when that takes place, then there's a danger that you have different procedures, protocols and legislation in place in different countries, which mean that there's not a level playing field, and it actually results in potentially damage to the environment if one country's operating at a much lower standard than the accepted level of all the others. So yeah, it has to be something that's taken across all nations.
Excellent, thanks for that. The next question I've got here is actually directed directly to Mark. I do apologise for my pronunciation of your name here. Grinas, I believe, and was asking, is there any current projects for tracking or capture of space debris by any of the ESA teams at the moment?
Tracking of space debris has been obviously in the public eye very much recently. We're affected by it on a regular basis because we have to take evasive action against space debris for many of our satellites that are in low Earth orbit, for instance. We've also had situations where unpiloted spacecraft or uncontrolled spacecraft come into line with one of our spacecraft, and based upon probability, our people who are controlling the spacecraft in Darmstadt are day-to-day monitoring and tracking things that could present a problem, I guess, for the satellites. So yeah, the space debris has come into our vizier as a consequence of the impact it could have on us. But it's a much wider debate today, and it's central to the whole clean space debate, because anybody who's launching an object should take responsibility for making sure it's deorbited afterwards, and that's something that goes into the design of every one of our spacecraft today, and that's a responsibility that we have to take in the future. So in fact, yes, debris mitigation is something that's being discussed at very high level amongst our member states. Obviously, it'll cost a lot of money to recover objects and help deorbit them. This is an expensive endeavor, and nobody wants to necessarily pay for launchers or for spacecraft that don't do a job other than clean our low Earth orbit of debris, for instance. So it can only be an international endeavor where we all take responsibility for ensuring that we're maintaining a clean space in the future. And that's as much a task of ESA, I guess, as everybody who's taking part in the space business.
Excellent, thank you for that. Next one has came in from anonymous, so someone that's a little bit shy, but I'll pass this over to Owen. How do you foresee the relationship of the UK space industry with ESA and the US changing with the developments in the UK space sector?
I'll try to be diplomatic and as I can be, but I would start from a point of view of I would like to see as close as possible cooperation, particularly between the UK and Europe generally, but I think there's a particular need for that when we're looking at space, given that we're not really talking about a huge area of the globe that would need to be covered, and actually operating on a Europe-wide basis needs to be pretty fundamental to my mind to move forward. I do have some concerns about some of the I suppose the forthcoming elements between the UK and the US. I'm not totally convinced of where the government in the UK currently are in relation to some of that. And I mean, we know that they've signed a draft technology safeguard agreement, but nobody's been able to see any of the detail of that yet. So, I mean, I'm currently asking questions in Parliament to try and find out when we're likely to see details of that sort of thing coming forward, because I think the innovation and advances that have undertaken in the UK space industry over a number of years now, it's such a growing industry that's contributing so much to local economies, it's contributing so much to schools education. I mean, the impact that the sort of simply having a space industry company in the area, again, it's the imagination thing to me. There's a real drive there, and I do have concerns that the current government are perhaps not as focused on that side of things as they are in getting a quick look, we've done this, which may, I don't know. I'm like I say, I'm trying to be as fair as I possibly can be, but would say I do have some concerns about the relationship between the UK and the US governments at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and sorry for putting you on the spot on that.
No, it's fine. I just, yeah, I mean, obviously when we get detail, then I will be the first one to say if I've been unfair. But I do think we need to look at that very, very closely when it comes forward.
Perfect, thank you for that. I've got time for two more questions. So one that we got in was towards John, and it was, what was his thoughts on using satellites to monitor performance against these SDGs, i.e. for assessing corruption in infrastructure, monitoring illegal logging and things like this? Does the act of creating a larger overview go against the sort of putting so many items into orbit?
Sorry, what's SDGs?
The Sustainable Development Goals. So.
Oh, sorry. So, what's my views on the current use? Yeah.
So, are we making enough leeway by putting up the extra satellites to help towards these goals, or are we just basically putting up as many bits and putting junk up there to block your view, basically, from what you need to do?
No, I think, you know, I mean, I'm not against satellites. Put it that way. It's just do it right. Basically, that's basically what I'm saying. I think satellites for monitoring sustainability and monitoring how we're getting on this planet are very important. We need them. I think the pros outweigh the cons. So I'm perfectly happy for, yes. I don't think people are actually putting up satellites for the sake of putting up satellites. Well, for the most part. But I think, yes, I think it's a necessary part of monitoring what the Earth's doing, because the advantages you get from that viewpoint, you can cover huge swathes of the Earth, which you absolutely would not be able to do anywhere near as efficiently on the ground. It has to be done from satellites. So I'm fine with that kind of thing. It's just, you you know, when it comes to something like the Starlink constellations, I'm a bit worried about that, on the effect it'll have on other things. I mean, I agree that you know, it'll bring the internet, fast internet, to places that are completely incommunicado in other ways. I don't know what the answer is. I'm just pointing out that there is a problem, you know, but I don't know what the answer is. So.
Thanks for that, John. And Ariel, for the last question we've got here, someone's asking, can you explain what your most recent project is that you're working on at the university, or what it is that you're working towards?
Was that for me?
Yes.
Oh, well, actually, it's really, really difficult, because the answer is whatever people want. It's quite a nice, honestly, it's a really nice way of doing it. So the project I'm on right now, there's a few different projects in John Moore's. One is, well, it's kind of partnerships for different universities. The one I work the most on is actually an ERDF funded project, so it's location specific. I love it, to be honest, because we can literally work with any company at all. What's happened to me, my background is actually offshore wind energy and engineering, but what's happened here is that over and over and over again, a company will come in thinking, you know, we will do things like, sorry, I'm trying not to go too broad here, but it's hard to narrow. A company will come in and they might say, oh, we want to have a technology tested, or, you know, we do a lot of carbon footprints and things. But usually what happens is, from that, we almost every time end up in the need for education, and that this is a marketing question. So I think what's been most interesting is the reason I think I'm really focused on the communication thing, because back to, it's kind of become a wider, more like, how do you actually make a sustainable, resilient community? And I think actually, I mean, it's interesting you're sitting in Scotland, because Glasgow's got what I think is a really good example, which is the Glasgow Indicators Project, which I think is just, I mean, I think it's a really good start. It actually noted, like, finding the areas which matter in a city, but it's so specific to each area. I guess if I can give an example, I'll try to think about, it's really difficult. I mean, they're really, really, really broad. Some of them have to do with, like, we're in Liverpool, so maybe a lot of shipping to, like, again, my background is offshore wind, so I might be interested in looking at, like, how can we reduce emissions from, like, a marine vessel? So just as maybe an example there, my PhD research was in trying to improve access to an offshore wind turbine and make it safer. But one of the main things I was interested in, well, how do we just make fewer trips? Because that's one of the major places of emissions for, say, offshore wind. It's one of the biggest areas. So rather than, like, how do I build this new, big, fancy technology, it's like, can we take this step back and think about, well, how can we just maybe do it differently? And to be honest, that's not really a great description of our project, but I think especially in this time right now, because we're obviously working with companies, to be honest, they're barely emitting at all, most of them, but we're still trying to think about what can you do to impact emissions in general. And it's like, you know, it might be a technology company, so not, I mean, I guess I won't name names, I'm sure they wouldn't mind, but just because I haven't asked, you know, it might be a company who is moving from installing gas boilers, and now they want to install heat pumps, but because people have been burned over and over and over again with, again, people over promising, he's now not only an engineer installing heat pumps, he's also somebody that has to convince people that heat pumps in general are a good thing. So, you know, what could have been a heat pump test project turned into a marketing messaging project, which was really interesting. I mean, I guess one of the main things, one of the things that we have that's really unique for where we are, which again, in this current time, not so helpful, but we've actually got houses on site. We have like a little neighborhood where we can physically test whatever we want technology in a house. We sit in the built environment. So even though that isn't my own background, a lot of it has to do with how people interact with the built environment. I mean, the answer is that every single company could have a role here. So my challenge is I get to like be surprised with a company And then we get to have this conversation where we start to think, well, is this a technology question? Is that what is this question? So that was probably too broad of an answer, but it's just, the goal is we need to reduce carbon emissions. Every single company has different roles to play, whether it's their own that they need to reduce or whether it's how they interact with other people. So I really get to, I mean, the things that I've learned about in the last, say, 2 years on the job are like anything comes in the door, and it's kind of this fun challenge.
Well, thank you very much for that. What I would ask is if you would like to add your LinkedIn profiles to the chat section, if you'd like people to follow your projects and such, or your, whether it be that or Twitter, feel free to do that just now. But a big thank you to Ariel, Owen, Mark and John for coming along today and discussing with us on the panel. And thank you to the attendees that sat and watched. But most of all, guys, please be safe, stay healthy, and cut down on the carbon. Have a good one.